Good evening, Mason Graham, BCT 217, Group 11, for case study number 9. Right, introduction, defining issues, contractual obligations, way forwards, and conclusions. Pretty basic introduction here. So, this is what the professor presented to us. I highlighted some things that really stick out and comes into play later on as we start to break this apart. But for just a general overview, here you go. Defining issues. So points of contention within this. We have a 70% project with a $14 million budget. All right, final bid is never secured. Silences consent and good faith business kind of comes into play here. We have a $15 million final budget based upon the revised complete documentation, and this is less than 10% increase of the original like $14 million projection. So, I mean, what's another $1 million on top of 14, especially when you only have 70% for the first budget. We have the original 20K was paid, but the GC wants additional 15 for the site setup. All right, there's a huge miscommunication with the owner and the GC going on. Is it possible ignorance on the owner part? Is the GC possibly taking advantage of owner? Does implied consent become relevant? These are things that we're really going to dig into here because there's a huge miscommunication, a lot of wording of documentation and contracts, that could present both sides. Right, contractual obligations, maintaining requirements. I think that's huge when we talk about contracts is defining what the contract states, establishing those requirements, and then maintaining and sticking and adhering to them. Contracts as defined by case. So I kind of broke it down in hard facts. $14 million medical building project based on 70% design, 20K pre-construction service contract, final terms of project not final, owner maintains site till construction start. That's pretty basic, right? Owner is obviously in charge of the site till final contract's done, GC's approved, everything good to go, right? Tentative facts. Potential $15 million budget revision based on updated and complete designs. Again, touched on that last slide, a couple slides ago, talking about, it's less than 10% increase for 30% more documentation. So, kind of broke it down. The pre-construction contract could be a potential cause of confusion, as this would tend to segue into a final contract. Pending the wording in contract could show the reason the GC moved forward. If wording doesn't provide wording to support this, then owner retains rights, right? So, and this is where the implied stuff we're going to dig into is based upon that pre-construction contract. Generally, once that is complete, that segues into the final contract. Now they talked about city permitting and everything. So the GC, he upheld his end of the bargain. He was in all the meetings, doing all the right things, step by step through this process. So it's fair to say that it is going well, and that it stands to reason that he will receive the final contract based upon how things are patterned within this process. If the pre-construction contract, has a 2-week clause based upon moving the stuff in, and the owner signed that, then the owner's at fault. So that's where this wording comes important, and I think that's the general overall theme for what the professor has really taught us is like when you make your contracts, you need to read them first of all, super important, but then really dig into what is defined, what are those requirements, sticking to those requirements and meeting them, right? So yeah, kind of beating a dead horse there, but just wanted to lay this out. Possible ways forward. Recoup and recovery. So the GC will probably be out of the 15K as he moved without proper authority clearance to go ahead, unless specific wording was used or conversation was documented. Now that's key, right? So we always talking about using a construction diary and all this stuff, and there should be documentation from throughout the pre-construction process. So if conversations were had between the GC and the owner, that would kind of imply or set patterns that this was okay, then legally it's kind of a gray area, but the GC would have a case if he wanted to take the owner to court. The other part of this, the owner allowed the GC to move onto the site. Again, he didn't say yes, but he saw that they were there for 2 weeks and never said anything, and that falls deeply into that implied consent, right? Was wording used that reassured GC on moving forward, right? Again, we're talking about documenting throughout the pre-construction process, setting those patterns. Did the GC feel confident that the bid he was going to receive the final bid and that the $15 million was going to be approved, right? Because that had to have come up at some point during this process where the 70% complete documentation had to have been, rectified. Like, so where's the owner at? Like, that's what I say earlier. Was the owner, ignorant to this? Was he not wrapped into the project as well as he should have been? Because he should have realized that an increase in budget was coming. And then I want to touch on if this project was lump sum, I believe the GC would have waited to confirm contract or permission to move forward once the pre-construction contractual obligations were met, right? Because he's not getting paid to move this stuff, right? So right now he believes in his mind, based upon the patterns and the implied consent that has been shown by the owner, that he was good to go. He met his pre-construction contractual obligations, met with the city, was there for all the design, all the meetings. So he is good to go onto the site, right? And then once he's on the site, the owner never said no for 2 weeks. So in his mind, the GC thinks he is right, but there is that, again, there was never consent or specified, yes, go ahead from the owner. So the owner retains that right. The owner sets those conditions. So the owner, in his mind, is thinking that, hey, we've got a big issue with this 15 million. Like, I thought it was 14 million. I'm not giving approval. Like, what are you doing on the site? Blah, blah, blah. We go through this process here, and that's where I was saying, like, is the owner has he not been a part of this conversation throughout this process? Just to kind of recap, again, unless the GC wants to take the owner to court, and he's going to have to go through a pretty lengthy battle to, get implied consent, to get, if there's any kind of documentation, just to get the 15,000, he's going to be 15,000 in legal fees long before he'd have just moved the stuff. All right, conclusion. Like I said, overall theme for this class for me is, we talk about all the different stuff that goes in the contract, but, contract is law. So we need to stick within the confines that contract represents. That's extremely important. While we do want to go above and beyond, we don't want to go so far as to put us in the negative, right? Written documentation importance. We stress that, through the multiple diaries we talked about, the construction site reports, like all this stuff needs to be maintained, needs to be organized, digital and manual copies, so that you're able to have documentation for when these come up, and more importantly, stay within your lane. If you're the GC, you've done your pre-construction contract, you submit your request with an increase, or you submit your final bid with an increase of $1 million, and the guy says no, then, generally speaking, you wouldn't have moved your stuff there to begin with, because you never got permission to go ahead with the project. So, stay within that contract boundaries. Stay in your lane, understand your situation and what could be at expense if you kind of move forward and overextend yourself. Thank you, Mason Graham, BCT 217, Group 11.